The morning post arrived at Fenwick Manor on a Thursday, carried up the gravel drive by the village boy who delivered twice a week, and left the letters in a stack on the hall table without ceremony or announcement. Viola Fenwick found them there at 7:30, before the rest of the household had come down, while the early summer light was still thin and tentative through the leaded windows, and the house smelled of cold ash and last night's candle smoke. She sorted through them standing in the hall in her oldest dress, the faded blue cotton she wore for early mornings and household tasks, her dark hair still loosely braided over one shoulder. Most were for her father, Sir Edmund Fenwick, estate business and creditors' correspondence, the usual papery evidence of a family living on the narrowing margin between respectability and ruin. One was for her stepbrother Geoffrey, who was at Oxford and wrote home only when he needed money. One was a bill from the milliner in Bath, addressed to her stepsister, Arabella. The last letter was addressed in handwriting Viola did not recognize, bold and angular, to the household at large. The Fenwick family, Fenwick Manor, Somerset no crest. No seal she could identify, though the paper was the heavy, expensive stock she associated with people who never had to think about the cost of paper. She opened it because she opened all the household correspondence. She had been managing the domestic accounts for 3 years, since her father's eyesight had deteriorated, and Arabella had made it clear she considered administrative work beneath her. The letter inside was brief. Lord Callum Ashby, Duke of Ravenscroft, requests the pleasure of the Fenwick family's company at Ashby Park, Saturday the 14th, for a garden party and luncheon. The Duke wishes particularly to improve his acquaintance with the neighbouring families of the county, having recently taken residence at Ashby Park following his return from abroad. Viola read it twice. Then she stood in the hall for a moment, listening to the silence of the sleeping house, and felt something unfamiliar move through her chest. Not excitement exactly, something more cautious, something that had learned to be cautious from years of practice. Ashby Park was 4 miles east of Fenwick Manor. It was the grandest estate in the county, a sprawling Palladian house set in 300 acres of formal gardens and parkland, with a lake that caught the light in the afternoon like a sheet of hammered silver. It had been empty for 6 years, its previous occupant, the old Duke of Ravenscroft, having died without direct heirs, the title passing through a complicated chain of succession to a nephew, who had been, by all county report, living somewhere on the continent. The Duke had come home. Viola set the letter on top of the pile and went to make the breakfast tea. Arabella found out about the invitation at 10 o'clock, when she came downstairs in her morning gown and found the post still sitting on the hall table where Viola had left it. Viola heard the shriek from the kitchen. It was not a shriek of alarm. It was the bright, operatic shriek of a young woman who has just received the best possible news and cannot contain it within the bounds of normal human expression. Arabella Fenwick, 20 years old, the daughter of Sir Edmund's second wife, was a creature of entirely uncomplicated ambitions and spectacular physical beauty. She had her mother's golden hair, her mother's china blue eyes, and her mother's absolute conviction that the universe had arranged itself primarily for her benefit. She burst into the kitchen with the letter held aloft like a military standard. "A duke," she announced. "There is a duke at Ashby Park, and he has invited us to a garden party." Viola poured the tea. "I know. I read the letter this morning. Why didn't you wake me?" Arabella demanded. "Because it is a letter, not a house fire." Arabella dropped into the kitchen chair across from Viola, with a dramatic rustle of her dressing gown, already reading the letter again with the focused intensity of a general studying a battle map. "Ravenscroft. The Duke of Ravenscroft. Do you know anything about him?" "Only what the letter tells me. He has been abroad. He has recently taken residence. How old is he? Is he married?" "The letter does not specify his age or marital status, Arabella. It is an invitation to a garden party, not a certificate of eligibility. Arabella ignored this. She was already somewhere else in her head, already at the party, already in the Duke's line of sight, already being assessed and found magnificent. It was a quality Viola had observed in her stepsister since childhood, the ability to inhabit a desired future so completely that the present became merely an inconvenient prelude. "I need a new dress," Arabella said. "We cannot afford a new dress. Father can advance my allowance. Father's allowance is already advanced through the end of the year." Arabella looked up from the letter. She focused on Viola with the sudden sharp attention of someone who has only just noticed the other person in the room. "You are not coming," Arabella said. It was not a question. Viola wrapped both hands around her teacup. "The invitation is to the Fenwick family. The invitation is a social occasion, Viola. Social occasions require people who are capable of being social. You are not." Arabella set the letter down and tilted her head with the pitying half-smile she used when she wanted to appear generous while delivering cruelty. "You know I love you. You are my sister in every way that matters. But you must see that bringing you to something like this would be doing you a disservice. You would be miserable. You hate crowds. You say the wrong thing to people. Last time we were at the Hargreaves' dinner party, you argued with Colonel Hargreaves about the Corn Laws for 40 minutes. He was factually incorrect about the Corn Laws. That is not the point," Arabella said. She stood, taking the letter with her. "The point is that some people are suited to these environments, and some are not. You are brilliant, Viola, in your way. But a Duke's garden party is not a library. It is a performance, and you are not a performer." She walked out of the kitchen, already calling for the housekeeper to discuss her wardrobe situation. Viola sat at the kitchen table with her tea. The morning light fell through the small window above the sink, catching the dust motes floating in the warm air. From upstairs came the sounds of Arabella's preparations beginning, the opening of wardrobes, the energetic consultation with the housekeeper about ribbons, and the possibility of retrimming the rose silk. Viola finished her tea. She washed the cup. She went to the estate account books and spent 2 hours doing the work that kept Fenwick Manor functioning, cross-referencing expenditures against income, writing carefully worded responses to the creditors who were becoming less patient, calculating how long the summer harvest income would hold off the most pressing debts. The numbers were not encouraging. They were, in fact, the numbers of a family approximately 18 months from a crisis. Sir Edmund's eyesight, worsening each month, would soon prevent him from managing the estate at all. Arabella's wardrobe bills were extravagant. Geoffrey's Oxford fees were significant. And the roof of the east wing was developing a leak that would cost more to repair than the household held in liquid assets. Viola had known about the financial situation for 2 years. She had told her father. He had nodded, patted her hand, and said something vague about the harvest improving. She had told Arabella, once. Arabella had accused her of being dramatic, and then gone out and ordered 3 new bonnets. The invitation to Ashby Park sat at the back of Viola's mind through the morning and into the afternoon. Not because of the Duke. She was not romantic in the way Arabella was romantic, did not construct elaborate fantasies about titled men and life-altering balls. She was, by nature and by necessity, a practical person. But she was also a 22-year-old woman who had spent 3 years managing a disintegrating estate in rural Somerset, who had not attended a social event of any significance since her father's eyesight had deteriorated to the point where he needed her at home, who had not had a real conversation with anyone outside the domestic sphere in months. She wanted to go. Not for the Duke, for the simple, human, desperately needed experience of being somewhere other than Fenwick Manor. She went to find her father. Sir Edmund was in his study, nominally reading the newspaper, actually holding it at a distance that made it clear he could see very little of it. He was a gentle man, her father, mild-mannered and somewhat adrift, with the slightly bewildered air of a person who had never quite understood why the world was harder than it ought to be. He had loved Viola's mother with a quiet, steady devotion that had never entirely recovered from her death. He had married his second wife, Arabella's mother, 5 years later, and when she too had died, 4 years after the marriage, he had retreated further into a vague, diffuse melancholy that expressed itself primarily through inaction. "Father," Viola said. She sat down across from him. "We have received an invitation to Ashby Park." "Have we?" Sir Edmund said, in the tone of a man who found all social occasions mildly exhausting. "The new Duke of Ravenscroft. A garden party on Saturday." "Ah, Ravenscroft, good family, old title." Sir Edmund set the newspaper down. "Your stepsister will be excited. She is already reorganizing her wardrobe." Viola said, "Father, I would like to attend as well." Sir Edmund looked at her. Through the fog of his failing eyesight and his habitual inattention, she saw a flicker of something. Guilt, perhaps the uncomfortable recognition of a man who knows he has not been paying adequate attention. "Of course you should attend," he said. "You are a Fenwick. The invitation is to the family. Arabella believes it would be better if I stayed home." The flicker of guilt solidified. "Arabella is young," Sir Edmund said carefully. "She does not always consider things from every perspective. She considers them from her own perspective with extraordinary thoroughness." Viola said. She kept her voice light, without bitterness. "Father, I am not asking you to adjudicate between us. I am simply informing you that I intend to attend the garden party." Sir Edmund reached across the desk and patted her hand. His grip was weak, uncertain, the grip of a man who could not hold the world together and knew it. "You should attend," he said. "Your mother would have wanted you to get out more." It was the most useful thing he had said in months. Viola had no new dress either. What she had was her intelligence, her needle, and a length of fabric left over from a project she had abandoned 2 years ago, a deep green silk her mother had purchased on a trip to Bath and never used, stored in the cedar chest in the sewing room. It was not fashionable, it was not trimmed with anything remarkable, and it took her until 2 in the morning on Friday to construct something wearable from it. The result was simple. Severely simple, in fact, in the way that things are simple when simplicity is the only available option. A high-waisted dress, with a narrow skirt and a plain square neckline, unadorned except for a narrow band of cream ribbon at the waist that she had salvaged from an old bonnet. She had no pearls, no garnets, no family jewellery worth wearing. She fastened her mother's small gold cross at her throat and called it sufficient. Arabella saw her Saturday morning and laughed. It was not a cruel laugh, or rather, it was not intentionally cruel. Arabella was not, in her own estimation, a cruel person. She was a person who said what she thought without filtering it through the question of how it would land, and who had never developed the empathetic imagination required to notice the damage. "Oh, Viola," Arabella said. She was standing in the entrance hall in her rose silk, freshly retrimmed with new white lace that had arrived via express from Bath, at a cost Viola had not yet had the heart to look at. Her golden hair was piled in an elaborate arrangement of curls, threaded with seed pearls. She was magnificent. Objectively, genuinely, jaw-droppingly magnificent. "You made that yourself?" "I did. You can tell," Arabella said, not viciously. Factually, in the tone of a person offering a neutral observation about the weather. "It is very plain. It is clean and well-fitted," Viola said. "That will have to be sufficient." The carriage arrived. Sir Edmund handed them in the distracted, simultaneous manner of a man trying to manage 2 daughters he does not entirely understand. Arabella arranged herself by the window with the practiced ease of someone long accustomed to being looked at. Viola sat opposite, her hands folded in her lap, watching the Somerset countryside roll past, and making herself feel nothing about the rose silk and the seed pearls. She was very good at making herself feel nothing. She had been practicing since she was 12. Ashby Park in summer was the kind of place that made you understand why people wrote poetry. The gates opened onto a long avenue of lime trees, their canopies meeting overhead to form a tunnel of green gold light. Beyond the avenue, the house rose in pale golden stone against the blue summer sky, its proportions so perfectly balanced that it seemed less built than grown, as if it had simply arrived at its current form through some process of natural inevitability. The formal gardens to the east were in full, glorious bloom, roses and lavender and sweet peas rioting in the warm air, and a string quartet set up on the terrace was playing something light and bright that floated across the lawns like a rumor of happiness. 50 or 60 guests were already gathered on the terrace and the wide sweep of lawn below it. Viola recognized most of them from church and from the intermittent social occasions she had attended over the years, the county families of Somerset, squires and baronets and their wives and daughters, all turned out in their finest for the new Duke's first social occasion. She did not immediately see the Duke. Arabella found 3 acquaintances within 30 seconds of descending from the carriage, and was absorbed into a cluster of young women who exclaimed over her dress and wanted to know everything about the new arrival at Ashby Park. Viola detached herself quietly and drifted toward the gardens, accepting a glass of lemonade from a passing footman. She found the roses. There was a walled garden at the south end of the formal grounds, separated from the main lawn by a low stone wall, and entered through a wrought iron gate. She had seen it from the avenue and been drawn to it by the dense, warm smell of roses drifting over the wall. Inside, it was quieter, the sounds of the party muffled by the stone and the thick plantings. Roses of every color grew in disciplined rows and tumbling cascades, red and white and deep gold and the pale blush pink of early morning. The air was heavy with their scent. Viola walked slowly down the central path, trailing her fingers along the petals of a climbing rose trained against the warm stone wall, and felt the tight coil of tension in her shoulders begin, very slightly, to loosen. "You know that one is a Cardinal de Richelieu?" The voice came from behind her, not startling, low and conversational, as if continuing a discussion already in progress. She turned. The man standing at the garden gate was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark red-brown hair that was slightly too long to be fashionable, and a face that was deeply tanned in a way that spoke of years in a southern climate. He wore a dark green coat, simply cut, with no decorative flourishes, and he stood with the relaxed, economical stillness of someone accustomed to outdoor spaces. His eyes were brown, warm and direct, with the slight crinkle at the corners of a person who spent a great deal of time squinting into bright light. He was looking at the rose she had been touching. "The Cardinal de Richelieu," Viola said. "The Gallica. I thought it was, but the purple is darker than I expected. Most illustrations show it as a lighter mauve." The man's expression shifted, a slight lift of the eyebrows, a fractional increase in attention. He stepped through the gate and came to stand beside her, looking at the rose with genuine interest. "Most illustrations are made in winter from pressed specimens," he said. "The color darkens in direct sun. In the south of France, this variety goes almost indigo." Viola looked at him properly. She had the sudden peculiar certainty that she was talking to the Duke of Ravenscroft, though she could not have explained precisely what gave him away. Not the quality of his clothes or the authority of his bearing, both of which were present but understated. Something in the way he occupied the space, the easy, unstudied proprietorship of a man in his own garden. "You have been to France," she said, "and Italy, and Greece, and further east than most people in that drawing room have thought to look. He extended his hand. "Callum Ashby. Viola Fenwick," she said, shaking it. His grip was firm, unhesitating. "You are the Duke. I am. No ceremony around it. No performance. You are a Fenwick of Fenwick Manor. I have met your father. He seems like a kind man." "He is," Viola said. "He is also going blind, which he does not tell people, and which makes running an estate considerably more difficult than he admits." She had no idea why she said that. It was not the kind of thing one said to a duke at a garden party. She waited for the polite, deflecting smile, the social pivot, the gentle recalibration of the conversation toward more comfortable territory. Callum looked at her. "That is an honest thing to say to someone you have just met." "I apologize. I am not particularly skilled at the performance of social pleasantness. I tend to say actual things." "Don't apologize," he said. "Actual things are a rarity today. I have been out here for 20 minutes specifically to avoid a conversation about whether my ballroom is large enough for a winter assembly." "Is it?" "Enormous. I could stable half the county's horses in it." He paused. "Is it the macular condition, your father's sight, or trauma?" Viola blinked. "Macular. How did you?" "I spent 3 years working with a field physician in the Ottoman provinces. You learn to recognize the way people hold their heads when the central vision goes. Your father was looking at me slightly to the side at our introduction, using his peripheral vision." He glanced at her. "I'm sorry. That was a clinical observation about your father at a garden party. Apparently neither of us is skilled at social pleasantness." Viola felt something entirely unexpected happen in her chest. A kind of opening. A door swung wide in a room that had been sealed shut for years. "There is no treatment," she said. "I have written to 3 physicians in London. They all say the same thing. 2 of them are probably right." Callum said. "The 3rd is a fraud selling electrotherapy as a cure for everything from gout to melancholy. Has your father's physician recommended darkened rooms?" "He has." "Does your father comply?" "He does not. He sits in the brightest room in the house and squints at newspapers he cannot read." Viola paused. "It is his form of resistance, I think. Acknowledging the condition feels like surrender." Callum nodded slowly. He looked not at her, but at the roses, as if giving her the space to have said what she said without the pressure of being watched. "My mother went deaf at 40, he said. "She refused to learn to sign for 2 years. She would nod at conversations she could not hear, and then conduct herself entirely on instinct and context, which worked surprisingly well until she agreed to sell a horse that she thought she was complimenting." Viola laughed before she could stop herself. The sound surprised her. She could not remember the last time she had laughed at a garden party. They walked the length of the rose garden. They talked about horticulture, about the Ottoman provinces, about the agricultural conditions in southern France and how they compared to Somerset. Callum asked about the estate management, the actual specifics of running a medium-sized Somerset property with declining income and an absentee heir at Oxford, and he asked in the way of someone genuinely interested in the mechanics, rather than making polite conversation. Viola answered him with equal honesty. She described the account books, the creditor situation, the roof of the East Wing. She watched his face for the flinch of distaste that well-bred men reliably produced when money problems were mentioned too baldly, and it did not come. "The East Wing roof is a stone problem, not a timber problem," Callum said, looking at the house over the garden wall. "I can see from here that the parapet is separating from the fascia. You need a mason, not a carpenter. It will cost 1/3 of what a carpenter would quote you." Viola stared at him. "How can you see that from here?" "Good eyes," he said simply. and 3 years helping build field hospitals in places where you could not afford to get the materials wrong. They had been in the rose garden for almost an hour when Arabella found them. She appeared at the garden gate in a swirl of rose silk and outrage. The outrage very carefully masked beneath a brilliant smile that only Viola, who had spent 20 years learning to read her stepsister, could identify as suppressed fury. "There you are," Arabella said. Her gaze moved from Viola to Callum, and the smile widened, recalibrated, became the specific smile she reserved for men she considered worthy of full deployment. "And you must be the Duke." "I am Arabella Fenwick, Viola's sister." She dropped into a curtsy of devastating precision, the rose silk pooling around her like a painting, her golden head bowed at the exact angle calculated to display the curve of her neck and the pearl threading in her hair. She was, as always, devastatingly effective. Callum inclined his head. "Miss Fenwick." Arabella rose and turned the full force of her attention on him, laying out her conversational repertoire with the practiced ease of a general deploying cavalry, light and charming and precisely calibrated. She was good at this. She was genuinely, formidably good at this. And Viola watched with the familiar mixture of admiration and exhaustion she always felt watching Arabella perform. "I have been so hoping to meet you," Arabella said. "The whole county has been curious since we heard you had taken up residence. We have all been wondering what would bring someone back from such adventures to quiet Somerset. Family property," Callum said, "and a preference for quiet." "Oh, but you must find us all terribly dull after the continent," Arabella said, with the practiced self-deprecation of someone who knows she is not dull, "though I hope to disprove the theory. I have always believed that one can have interesting conversations anywhere, if one is willing to have them." "A generous philosophy," Callum said. He was polite, perfectly polite, but Viola, watching, noticed something. The quality of his attention had not changed. He was not deploying the specific, heightened focus he had brought to their conversation about the roses and the east wing parapet. He was simply being courteous. Arabella noticed too. Viola could see it in the infinitesimal adjustment of her stepsister's smile, the micro-recalibration of someone who has expected a door to open and found it simply ajar. "I must introduce you to some of the other guests," Arabella said, extending her hand with the light authority of someone accustomed to orchestrating social situations. "Lady Hargreaves has been desperate to meet you, and the Corley sisters are, in a moment," Callum said. He turned back to Viola. "You were going to tell me about the barley yield this season." Arabella's hand remained extended for a fraction of a second too long before she lowered it. "The barley," Viola said. She felt the heat of Arabella's attention on the side of her face like a physical pressure, but she kept her eyes on Callum. "The South Field has been underperforming for 3 years. I believe the soil is depleted. The previous tenant was running winter wheat on a 2-year cycle without adequate fallow. What rotation are you planning? I would like to try a 4-field system. Father's steward thinks it is too modern. I think the steward is 68 and has not changed his methods since the Napoleonic Wars." Callum's expression, already attentive, sharpened further. "I have been reading Howard's work on soil chemistry. Have you come across it?" "I wrote to him 6 months ago," Viola said. He was kind enough to respond. "His analysis of the nitrogen depletion pattern matches exactly what I am seeing in the South Field." The silence from Arabella's direction was the silence of a woman reassessing an entire situation. The garden party rolled on around them. Callum fulfilled his duties as host, circulating, making introductions, accepting compliments on the house and the gardens, with a grace that suggested he was capable of being socially functional when required, but did not particularly enjoy it. He spoke to Lady Hargreaves about the assembly plans. He accepted an invitation from Mr. Corley to inspect his prize cattle the following week. He was pleasant, measured, adequate, but he came back to Viola 3 times. The first time was to deliver a glass of iced lemon water because he had noticed her glass was empty. The second was to introduce her to his estate steward, a young man named Fletcher, who had been working on soil chemistry and who, it emerged, had been wrestling with the same nitrogen depletion questions Viola had written to Howard about. The two of them spent 20 minutes in a corner of the terrace discussing field rotation, with an intensity that cleared a social radius around them. Because people at garden parties are not accustomed to conversations about nitrogen content, and retreat accordingly. The third time was near the end of the afternoon, when the party was beginning to thin and the shadows were lengthening across the lawn. Viola was sitting on a stone bench near the terrace, waiting for her father, who was being escorted by the butler toward the carriage. Callum sat down beside her. "Fletcher wants to continue the conversation about the South Field," he said. "He has been fighting my head steward on similar grounds for 2 years and is thrilled to find an ally." "Tell him to write," Viola said. "I have all the yield data for the past 8 years. I've been keeping it since I started managing the accounts." Callum was quiet for a moment. He looked out over the lawn, where the last guests were clustered in small groups, their voices carrying lightly across the warm afternoon air. "You have been managing the estate accounts," he said, "for 3 years. At 19. 22 now. At 19, he repeated. "Alone, my father's sight was already compromised by then. Someone had to." He turned to look at her. The afternoon light was golden now, slanting, and it caught the green silk of her dress and lit it from within like sunlight through a leaf. She looked back at him steadily. She had been looked at in many ways over the years, assessed and found wanting and dismissed and ignored. This was something else. This was the look of a man encountering something he had not expected to find, studying it with the careful, respectful attention of someone who understands that rare things should be approached slowly. "Miss Fenwick," he said, "Your Grace, I would like to call on Fenwick Manor next week." Viola looked at him. She took a breath. "If you are planning to discuss the Southfield rotation with me, you are welcome. If you are planning something else, I should tell you in advance that I am not a drawing-room ornament. I am terrible at accepting compliments. I will argue with you about agricultural science with a thoroughness most people find exhausting, and I have been managing a financially precarious estate for 3 years, which means I have no patience for people who are not serious." Callum's mouth curved. Not a performed smile, not the social expression he had been deploying all afternoon. Something real, something that started at the eyes. "I am planning to discuss the South Field rotation, and everything else." "Then you may call," Viola said. She walked to the carriage. Her father took her arm, his grip uncertain and grateful, and she guided him down the terrace steps with the practiced ease of long habit. Behind her, she heard Arabella making her farewells, the bright, rippling social music of her stepsister's voice, and felt, just barely, the sharp edge of Arabella's gaze cutting between her shoulder blades. The carriage ride home was conducted in a significant silence. Arabella sat by the window, her hands folded in her lap, her jaw set at an angle that Viola had learned to associate with the very controlled processing of something she did not want to acknowledge. Sir Edmund dozed between them, his head nodding gently with the motion of the carriage. "He spoke to you for an hour," Arabella said finally. Not accusatory. Quiet, factual, in the tone of someone cataloguing evidence. "We found common ground," Viola said carefully. "About what? Farming? Soil chemistry? Rose varieties? Field rotation?" Viola paused. His mother's deafness. Arabella looked at her, The expression on her face was complicated, several emotions moving beneath the surface simultaneously. Frustration and confusion, and something underneath both of those that might, in a more honest moment, have been something close to hurt. "You said the wrong things," Arabella said. "You talked about the estate debts and father's eyes and the roof. Yes, you cannot tell a duke about your family's financial problems at a garden party. Apparently I can," Viola said. Arabella looked out the window. The Somerset countryside rolled past, green and gold in the evening light. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter. "He walked past me," she said. It was not quite a complaint and not quite a question. He was perfectly polite. He was kind. "But he walked past me." She paused. "To get back to you." Viola said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. "You are not worthy of a duke," Arabella said. The words came out flat, without the usual sharpening edge of deliberate cruelty. She said it the way she said most things, as a statement of observed fact rather than an attack. "That is not an insult, Viola. It is a practical observation. You have no dowry. You manage the household. You are quiet and plain, and you argue about farming at parties. That is not what dukes look for. Perhaps this duke is looking for something different," Viola said. Arabella turned from the window and looked at her stepsister. In the fading light, with the social performance stripped away by exhaustion and genuine bewilderment, she looked younger. She looked, for a moment, like the girl she had been at 8 years old, standing in the hallway of Fenwick Manor in her nightgown, newly arrived with her mother, looking at Viola with a mixture of wariness and the desperate unspoken hope of a child who wanted to be liked. "Don't let yourself hope," Arabella said. "It will hurt worse if you do." It was the most honest, the most genuinely sisterly thing she had said in years. Viola looked at the dark countryside beyond the carriage window and said nothing. She was already hoping. She had been hoping since the Rose Garden, since Cardinal de Richelieu and the Southfield nitrogen depletion and the sound of a man's laugh about a horse. She was going to have to live with the consequences of that, whatever they were. Callum called on Wednesday. He arrived at Fenwick Manor at 11 in the morning, without ceremony, on horseback rather than in a carriage, tying his horse at the gate himself rather than summoning a groom. Viola was in the estate office when she heard the knock. A small room at the back of the house with one window overlooking the kitchen garden, so crowded with account books and correspondence and the general administrative debris of a struggling property that there was barely room for the second chair she had dragged in for visitors. The housekeeper showed him in. He looked at the room, at the stacked ledgers and the map of the fields pinned to the wall with the problem areas marked in red ink, at the chair with its pile of correspondence that Viola hastily removed, and his expression was one of uncomplicated recognition. The expression of a man who has spent time in field hospitals and working estates, and is entirely at home in functional spaces. "Show me the map," he said. They spent 4 hours in the estate office. He looked at the accounts, not intrusively, but with the attentive interest of someone who understood numbers and the stories they told. He asked questions about the tenants, about the crop history, about the specific financial obligations that were creating the most immediate pressure. Then he said the thing she had not expected. "Your steward needs to retire, not because he is incompetent. Because he is doing things the way they were done in 1790, and you cannot pull a 1790 estate into 1820 without someone who understands what has changed." He paused. "Fletcher will give you a reference for a young man he trained. He is 24, he has been reading the new agricultural science, and he is, according to Fletcher, annoyingly enthusiastic about nitrogen. The position pays £30 a year," Viola said. "I cannot offer more without restructuring the accounts. The young man will take 30. Callum said. He is more interested in the practical application than the salary at this stage of his career. Viola looked at him. "You discussed this with Fletcher before you came." I discussed it with Fletcher after you left on Saturday. Callum said, I have been thinking about your south field since then. The afternoon light was moving across the estate office floor. The kitchen garden was visible through the small window, the runner beans climbing their poles, the cabbages in orderly rows. Everything Viola had planted and tended and worried over, visible in miniature through a single pane of slightly warped glass. Why? She asked. Why was I thinking about your south field? Why are you here? Really? She met his eyes directly. You are a duke. You have an estate of several thousand acres to manage. You have 50 guests on Saturday demanding your time and attention. You could have sent Fletcher. You did not have to come yourself. Callum was quiet for a moment. He looked at the map on the wall. The red ink marks she had made over 3 years of careful attention to a piece of land that was struggling. My father was a man who valued surfaces, he said. He valued the appearance of things. The house, the title, the right wife at the right dinner table. He died when I was 20, and I inherited an estate that looked magnificent and was financially hollow because he had spent 40 years maintaining the performance of wealth while the substance rotted underneath. He paused. I went abroad because I needed to find out what was real, what actually mattered, what a life was for. He turned back from the map. You are the most real person I have met since I returned to England. Viola's breath was not quite steady. She made it steady. That is a great deal to say on a Wednesday, she said. I know. He did not look apologetic. I told you I have been abroad for years. I have very limited patience for the indirect approach. So do I, Viola said. As it happens, they looked at each other across the small, crowded, entirely unglamorous estate office of a financially precarious Somerset manor, and the air between them was charged with something that had no name in the social vocabulary of garden parties and drawing rooms, something older and more fundamental. I would like to come back on Friday, Callum said, to meet your father properly, and to see the south field. My father will talk about my mother for 20 minutes before he says anything relevant. Viola warned. I will be honored to listen, Callum said. He rode back to Ashby Park in the afternoon, and Viola sat in the estate office after he left, and held very still, listening to the sounds of the house around her, the distant clatter of the kitchen, the creak of the old structure settling in the afternoon heat, and felt the strange, precarious sensation of something shifting in the architecture of her life. Arabella found her there an hour later. She had spent the morning in her room, conspicuously absent during Callum's visit, a pointed absence that was its own form of statement. She sat down in the visitor's chair and looked at her stepsister with an expression that was, for once, stripped of its usual performing layers. He stayed 4 hours, Arabella said. He did. What did you talk about? The accounts, the crop rotation, the steward situation. Viola paused. His father. Arabella was quiet. She picked up a pencil from the desk and turned it in her fingers, end over end. A nervous habit she had had since childhood. I have been thinking, Arabella said, about what I said in the carriage. Which part? The part about you not being worthy of a duke. She did not look up from the pencil. I said it because I believed it. I believed it because I have been told, my entire life, that worth is measured in a specific way. Appearance, comportment, dowry, social skill. And by those measures, I am the asset, and you are the liability. She paused. I have been understanding this week that I may have been measuring the wrong things. Viola looked at her stepsister. She felt the complicated weight of 20 years of history between them, the kindnesses and the cruelties, and the fundamental loneliness of 2 girls who had been placed in the same household and never quite managed to build the bridge they both, somewhere underneath the performance, had wanted. You are not a liability, Arabella, Viola said quietly. You are not merely an ornament either. You are clever and perceptive, and capable of great warmth when you are not performing. The tragedy is that you have been taught to perform so consistently that you have forgotten the difference. Arabella set the pencil down. Her eyes were bright. That is a very Viola thing to say, she said. Direct and slightly devastating. I learned from living with you. Viola said, You taught me what it costs to say nothing, because I watched it cost you over and over. The silence between them was different from the usual silence. It was a working silence, two people processing something true. I am not going to apologize for not including you in things, Arabella said finally, because if I start apologizing for that, I will be apologizing for years, and neither of us has the time. She looked up, but I think perhaps I could stop. It was not, Viola thought, the most gracious offer ever made. But it was honest, and honesty, she had recently been reminded, was a rarity worth valuing. That would be a reasonable start, she said. Callum came on Friday as promised. He spent 40 minutes with Sir Edmund in the study, and when he emerged, her father's face held an expression Viola had not seen in years, the particular warm-eyed animation of a man who has been genuinely heard and responded to. He has been to Palmyra, Sir Edmund announced at luncheon, with the voice of a man who has discovered a rare collector's item. He has actually been to Palmyra. And the Anatolian Plateau. The boy has read everything. Viola, he has read everything your grandfather read and more besides. Viola met Callum's eyes across the luncheon table. He looked, she thought, deeply relieved, as if he had been afraid of this meeting and found it, instead, entirely natural. He walked the south field with her afterward. They went in their day clothes, her in her faded blue working dress, him in his plain coat, walking the boundary of the underperforming field while she explained the problem and he listened and occasionally crouched to examine the soil texture with his fingers. He took a small knife from his pocket and cut a channel into the earth, examining the layers, pressing the sides to assess the moisture retention. Howard's right about the nitrogen, he said. He stood and brushed the soil from his hands. But you also have a drainage problem in the north corner. See how the color changes? That patch has been waterlogged at some point, probably last winter. The roots cannot establish properly in waterlogged soil regardless of the nitrogen content. Viola looked at the color variation in the earth. She had noticed it and not known what it meant. Now she saw it. What do we do about the drainage? Your new steward will know. But essentially you need a channel. Possibly a tile drain running west to the ditch line. He straightened and looked at the field, the full sweep of it under the summer sky. This is good land, Viola. It is tired and it has been mismanaged, but it is good land. With the right attention, you could have this field producing twice its current yield within 3 years. Viola looked at the field. She looked at the land she had been fighting for, worrying about, lying awake, calculating in the dark. She felt the familiar, fierce, exhausting love she had for this impractical, difficult, failing, irreplaceable place. My father will leave it to Geoffrey, she said. When he dies, the entail passes to Geoffrey. I have been building something that will belong to someone else. Callum was quiet. I know that, she said. I have known it for 3 years. I do not do this because I will own it. I do it because it needs doing. Because the tenants who depend on this land deserve for someone to pay attention. She paused. I do not say that to be noble. I say it because I think you should know what kind of person you are dealing with. I am not a tragic figure, and I do not want your pity. I am simply a person who does the work in front of her. I know, Callum said. He looked at her. The afternoon light was full and golden, falling across the field and across her face. That is exactly what I mean when I say you are the most real person I have encountered since I returned. You should stop saying things like that, Viola said, It makes it very difficult to maintain appropriate distance. Good, he said. She stared at him. Good? Appropriate distance has its place. This is not that place. He paused. I am not a man who operates well at appropriate distance. I was raised in a household that maintained so much appropriate distance that the people in it eventually forgot what they actually felt about anything. I went abroad to find out what I felt. I found out. He met her eyes steadily. I am telling you what I feel. You can do with that information whatever you choose. You barely know me, Viola said. I know you kept 8 years of yield data and wrote to agricultural scientists at 19. I know you walked into my garden party in a dress you made yourself and spent the first 20 minutes looking at roses instead of trying to attract attention. I know you told me about your family's financial problems within the first quarter hour of our acquaintance, because you were not interested in performing a version of your life that was not real. He paused. I know the substance of you, Viola. The rest is time. The south field lay around them, golden and imperfect, full of promise and depletion simultaneously, needing attention and getting it. You will want to meet with Fletcher and the new steward before committing to the tile drain approach, she said. Her voice was not quite steady. Next week. Callum agreed, and you should review the Westfield accounts before next season's planting decisions. Monday, and I should tell you that I am still not a drawing room ornament. I am deeply relieved to hear it, he said. He came back Monday, and Thursday, and the following week, and the week after that, through the long, golden Somerset summer, through the harvest planning and the creditor negotiations, and the discovery of the tile drainage issue, which proved worse than either of them had expected, and the hiring of the new steward, who was indeed annoyingly enthusiastic about nitrogen. He came to Sunday luncheon and let Sir Edmund talk about Palmyra. He came to the annual tenants' meeting and sat beside Viola, and the tenants, who had known Viola for years and trusted her implicitly, looked at the Duke, who was clearly listening to everything she said, and adjusted their estimation of him accordingly. He came in the evening sometimes, simply to continue conversations they had left unfinished, and sat in the estate office while she worked, reading, both of them in the comfortable, productive silence of people who have found they can occupy the same space without requiring performance. Arabella watched. She watched with the careful, assessing attention she brought to everything, and she saw something she had not expected to see. Not the transactional exchange of a man acquiring a manageable wife and a woman acquiring a title. Something else entirely. Two people of equal and unusual seriousness who had found, in each other, the very rare thing of being genuinely understood. She came to Viola one evening at the end of August. Viola was in the estate office as usual. Arabella sat in the visitor's chair and was quiet for a moment. "Do you love him?" she asked. Viola looked up from the accounts. Outside, the evening light was failing, the kitchen garden dissolving into soft blue shadow. "Yes," she said. There was no performance in it. Just the truth, stated plainly in an estate office surrounded by account books, which was, Viola thought, exactly the right setting. Arabella nodded slowly. "Does he know?" "He is a perceptive man." "That is not an answer." "No," Viola said. "I have not said the specific words." "You should." Arabella said, "You argue about soil chemistry. You tell him about the creditors. You manage to be direct about every other aspect of your existence. This seems inconsistent." Viola looked at her stepsister. In the fading light, Arabella looked different. The golden brightness was softer, the performance quieter. She looked like a person working something out. "Are you giving me romantic advice?" Viola said. "I am giving you tactical advice." Arabella said. "I am very good at tactics. I have simply been applying them to the wrong problems." She stood. "Tell him. People like you and him, serious, direct, utterly incapable of small talk, you wait for the other person to go first, and then you both wait forever, and it is extremely inefficient." She walked out. Viola sat in the silence of the estate office for a long time, listening to the evening sounds of the house settling, and knew her stepsister was right. Callum came the next day. He arrived at the usual time, on horseback, tying his own horse at the gate. Viola met him in the garden rather than the office. The kitchen garden at the end of August was at its peak, the runner beans heavy on their poles, the cabbages full, the late summer vegetables Viola had planted in May now ripening in the warm morning sun. He looked at the garden with the assessing, appreciative attention he brought to all growing things, and she watched him look, and thought about what Arabella had said about efficiency. "Callum," she said. He turned. "I am in love with you," Viola said. "I have been for approximately 6 weeks. I wanted you to know because you have been consistently direct with me about everything that matters, and continuing to avoid being direct with you about this feels dishonest, and I have committed to honesty as a general operating principle." She paused. "That is all I wanted to say." Callum looked at her. Standing in her kitchen garden in her faded blue working dress, her dark hair pinned up in the practical, unadorned way she wore it when she was gardening, soil on her hands, the late summer light warm on her face. Nothing performed, nothing designed, just herself entirely. He crossed the garden in 4 strides and kissed her. It was not a tentative kiss. It was the kiss of a man who had been waiting for permission, and had received it, and was not inclined toward understatement. She kissed him back with equal conviction, her soil-stained hands against his coat, the kitchen garden around them extravagantly, silently indifferent. When they separated, both of them breathing slightly faster, she looked at him. "That is also all I wanted to say," Callum said. His voice was rough at the edges. "Although, in my case, it has been 8 weeks, not 6. You were slower. I was being respectful of your autonomy. You were being cautious. Also that." He kept his hands on her shoulders, steadying. "Viola, I want to marry you. I have wanted to marry you since the rose garden, when you told me my illustration books were inaccurate, and then apologized for saying an actual thing." His expression was serious, stripped of all the mild social armor he wore as a duke. "I have 12,000 acres and £35,000 a year, and an enormous empty house, and a strong preference for not spending my life in it alone. I have never met anyone with whom I could imagine being genuinely not alone. Your house is not entirely empty," Viola said. "Fletcher is there. Fletcher is excellent, but not a substitute for a wife." He paused. "Will you?" Viola looked at him. She thought about the South Field, about the 8 years of yield data, about the account books and the creditors and the roof of the East Wing, and all the small, daily, unglamorous work of keeping something alive that wanted to fail. She thought about arriving at Ashby Park in a dress she had made herself, and finding a man in a rose garden who wanted to talk about actual things. "Yes," she said. "But I want it in writing that the South Field rotation is my decision." Callum laughed. The sound broke across the kitchen garden like light. "Everything at Fenwick Manor is your decision. You have been making every decision for 3 years. And Ashby Park? We will argue about it," he said. Productively, she smiled. "Good," he proposed formally that afternoon, in the drawing room, with Sir Edmund present. Her father, who had been quietly observing the situation with more attention than his failing sight suggested was possible, shook Callum's hand, and then, unexpectedly, embraced him. The embrace was brief and slightly clumsy and entirely sincere. "Take care of her," Sir Edmund said. His voice was thick. "She takes care of everyone else. Someone should take care of her." Callum looked at Viola over her father's shoulder. "I know," he said quietly. "I intend to." Arabella was the last to be told. She was in the garden when Viola found her, sitting on the stone bench in the back garden with her embroidery, a placid domestic scene that Viola knew concealed considerable inner activity. He proposed, Viola said. Arabella set down her embroidery. She looked at her stepsister for a long moment. "Are you happy?" she asked. "Yes, good." She picked up her embroidery again. "I told you the direct approach was more efficient." "You did," Viola said. "Thank you." Arabella was quiet for a moment. Then, without looking up from her embroidery, she said, "I have been thinking about the governess registries. 3 families I know in Bath are looking for companions. Educated women, the sort who can have a sensible conversation about something other than ribbons." She paused. "I believe I have been underestimating what I am capable of when it is not directed at a duke." Viola sat down beside her on the bench. They were quiet together in the late summer garden, the way they had rarely been quiet, without competition or performance or the long, exhausting labor of navigating each other's defenses. "You would be very good at it," Viola said, "if you wanted to." "I might want to," Arabella said. "I have been thinking about wanting different things." It was, Viola thought, the most hopeful conversation they had ever had. They married in October, in the village church in Langford, with the autumn countryside turned to gold and copper around them, and the smell of wood smoke and ripening apples in the cold morning air. The church was full, every tenant from both estates, the county families who had watched the courtship with varying degrees of bewilderment and growing respect, Sir Edmund in the front pew with Arabella's hand on his arm. Viola wore green. A new dress, this time made by a proper seamstress from deep forest green velvet, but with the same severe, clean simplicity she had imposed on her own making of the silk. She carried no bouquet, because flowers in October were scarce, and she thought the whole custom slightly performative. She walked herself down the aisle, because her father's sight made the traditional procession impractical, and because it suited her. Callum watched her walk toward him, and did not pretend to be anything other than exactly what he was, a man looking at the person he intended to spend his life with, entirely unable to maintain the polite composure that the occasion technically demanded. The vows were read. They were said with the gravity of people who meant every word and understood the weight of what they were promising. Afterward, in the churchyard, while the guests milled and the autumn light fell golden through the churchyard trees, Arabella found her. She looked at Viola for a moment, taking her in. The green velvet, the gold cross, the complete absence of performance. "You are not worthy of a duke," Arabella said. She paused. Then she smiled, and for the first time in 20 years, it was entirely genuine, warm and rueful and real. "I was wrong about that." Viola looked at her stepsister. She thought about the carriage ride home from the garden party, about "don't let yourself hope," about all the years of the wrong metrics applied to the wrong questions. "I know," Viola said. Arabella laughed. She reached out and straightened the gold cross at Viola's throat, the precise, unconscious gesture of a sister, and then stepped back as Callum appeared at Viola's side, his hand finding hers. "Ready?" he said. "Always," Viola said. They walked out of the churchyard together, into the October light, the gold and copper landscape of Somerset in autumn, impractical and beautiful, and entirely real. Nobody gets to decide your worth. Not a sister who measures by the wrong metrics, not a world that values performance over substance, not a lifetime of being told you are too plain, too direct, too unglamorous to deserve the things that matter. Viola Fenwick spent years doing the invisible, unglamorous work of keeping something alive, and the man who finally saw her walked past all the performance to find her in a rose garden, talking about actual things. If this story of quiet substance, honest love, and the courage to say what is real moved you, please like the video, share it with a friend, and subscribe for more stories about the people who are found by those worth finding.